All right, welcome back to Brain and Behavior. We're now moving on to our neuroanatomy chapter in the course. That's going to be chapter 2 in your textbook. One thing I wanted to do is point out a really good resource that's free and available to you for this. If you have a smartphone or like an iPhone or Android phone, there's an app called 3D Brain. So if you search for it, you should see something that looks like this on your phone. You can download it for free. It allows you to rotate and zoom in and out on different structures in the brain that we'll be talking about. Anatomy of the central nervous system is particularly difficult because it is so three-dimensionally organized. And I think this app does a wonderful job at looking at that. You can see once you have it installed, you can look at up structures. You can click this T to get a little info about the structures. You can do some little tests on yourself. It's just an absolute wonderful app, and it's amazing that it's free and available to you. I don't think it's necessary. There is an opportunity to upgrade for the paid app, but I think everything that it offers in free will be perfect for this class to help you get a little deeper into the neuroanatomy. There are some case studies in there that are kind of fun to review and go through, so you might want to check those out as well. But this is just a great app. Again, it's available for the iPhone and Android phones, so if you check the 3D Brain, it's something you might be a really good resource in preparing for this course. So again, what we're going to do today is focus on the neuroanatomy of the central nervous system. So we're going to talk about how to get around, how to navigate the central nervous system by talking about certain directions. We'll discuss the development of the central nervous system. Now this is really meant to help you understand the relationship between different structures of the central nervous system and really how the central nervous system develops in the relationship between those structures. Then we'll talk about the central nervous system itself, talk about the different structures and their associated functions. We'll talk about how the central nervous system is protected, both the meninges and the skull, their role. We'll talk about how blood is supplied to different structures within the central nervous system. And then we'll talk about how it's a crossed brain, how functions on one side of the central nervous system function to help aid function on the other side of the body. So we'll go ahead and get started. One thing I think is kind of easier with an animal that's organized horizontal is talking about dorsal, ventral, rostral, caudal directions. So here we have a alligator or some type of reptile, and the central nervous system is displayed here more horizontally. Anything towards the back of the animal is referred to a dorsal portion of the central nervous system. Anything closer to the belly is referred to as the ventral portion of the central nervous system. Structures of the central nervous system are closer towards the nose or the eyes. That's considered a rostral structure. Anything that is closer towards the bum of the animal is called caudal portions. And it's fairly easy when they're arranged in one dimension or just in one plane. However, the human central nervous system, because we walk upright, has a major bend in it. So here is a picture of a brain, a human brain, and we can see here is the spinal cord down here, and there's a significant bend. So it's almost like we would take this brain and spinal cord of this reptile here, and at this point we were to flex it forward. And if we were to do that, what we'll see is that those directions maintain their relationship to one another. They just follow the bend up. So caudal would be towards the back of the brain, or if you were to pat the back of your head, that would be the caudal portion, right where the occipital lobe is. We'll talk about that more in detail. Rostral, if you were to pat the front of your forehead, if you were to pat your forehead, that would be the rostral part of your brain. If you were to pat the top of your head, that's the dorsal portion. And if you were to kind of try to pat your cheek by your ear, that would be more the ventral portion of the brain by your temporal lobe. So that gives you an idea of what those directions are in the central nervous system. Dorsal, ventral, rostral, and caudal sections or directions in the central nervous system. And that applies to both the spinal cord. So if you were to pat your back, you would be touching an area related to the dorsal portion of the spinal cord, or closer towards your belly would be the ventral portion of the spinal cord. Now, beyond this, we can talk about whether structures are closer to the midline or farther away from the midline using terms lateral and medial. Structures that are farther away from the midline are referred to as lateral structures. We'll hear about the lateral geniculate nucleus later in the semester. That's farther away from the midline. Structures that are closer to the midline are referred to as medial. We'll hear about the medial septum that falls right on the midline. There's a structure there. So we'll use those terms to refer to those two directions. We'll also see different sections of the central nervous system. We'll see coronal sections. This is represented here in this picture. The structure would be neat to look across these three is called the corpus callosum, and it's this white band of fibers that connects the hemispheres together. And we can see the corpus callosum right here in this coronal section. Now, if you want to think about coronal sections, how they're cut, you can imagine how a portrait of somebody wearing a crown, and that crown were to slide down and slice through the brain, and you would get this coronal section. So here in this picture we can see this crown, and you can think of that crown sliding down through the portrait, and after the face falls off you would see a coronal section of the brain, and one of the prominent features here would be the corpus callosum. Now, another section to the brain is called a horizontal section, where you can imagine a sheet of glass cutting through the brain as though it was the horizon cutting through, and we can have different levels there. Here in this horizontal section, we can see the corpus callosum is located there, as well as here. So we can have more horizontal or more dorsal horizontal sections, or more ventral horizontal sections. And finally, we have sagittal. Sagittal views basically cut the brain down the midline. You can kind of think of somebody with a bow and arrow, and the arrow, the bow, the string of the bow, extending through the body, cutting it in half. And here we have a very medial section. It's actually right on the midline. And here we can see the corpus callosum right here, the structure as well. And that kind of explains across these, you need these three different views. So we see the corpus callosum here. We see the corpus callosum in the horizontal section, but it's in two places. So how can we have it in two places and one and not the other? Well, if we look at the sagittal view, we can see if we took a horizontal section at this level, we would see corpus callosum at the more rostral extent and more caudal extent at this view, and we wouldn't see it in those intermediate ranges. So as we go through this, you want to keep track of what a coronal section is. Remember, we could have more rostral or caudal. What a horizontal section is, it can be more dorsal or ventral, and we can also have a sagittal section that's more medial or lateral. Now, one of the ways I like to kind of discuss or break down the central nervous system is looking at it from the developmental context. And that helps you understand how the brain is related, brain structures are related to one another. During day 18, what we see is the neural plate starts to form down the midline of this embryonic disc. And so we see there's this thickening here that occurs on day 18, where down the midline there's this thickening, the membrane becomes much thicker, and as that continues on to day 21, we see that now that thickening starts to droop down. So we're adding additional cells It's almost like if you took a sheet of paper and you were to push it together, the two sides would loop down and you'd start to see this neural groove forming. By day 22, at that middle portion here, we see that neural groove actually pinches off and forms the neural tube. So there's neural tube forms. And then that will proceed both rostral and caudal along that neural groove. So by day 22, we see that neural tube forming and it'll start to close. By day 24, the neural tube is entirely enclosed. So here we have a picture of that neural tube. It's completely enclosed both rostrally and caudally along the extent of the organism. And from day 24 on, this neural tube does three things. Three things that gives rise to the adult central nervous system. It thickens, it elongates, and it bends. So you can kind of think of a garden hose or maybe one of those long balloons that you would tie and make balloon animals out of. As this develops, what happens is parts of the balloon will expand, it'll get thicker, and it will also become much longer, and there will be bends. But the entire central nervous system is like different points along this neural tube or this balloon. So you have a rostral end that's closer to the head, and a caudal extent which is closer towards the bone. And so we can divide this neural tube into different components. Our first component is called the telencephalon, and it's this purplish kind of two bubbles here that we see. The telencephalon will eventually give rise to the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia, arguably some of the most highly developed aspects of the central nervous system. As we see from 40 days on to 3 months, there is continued folding and bending of this, and that's this purple structure is the cortex. Within it is part of the basal ganglia we'll talk about. But what we see here is this continued thickening and bending occurring here. After the telencephalon, we see this other purplish bump here is the diencephalon. So you can kind of think of taking that balloon, and the first part is the telencephalon. The second part that we're going to have is called the diencephalon. And then it'll give rise in adulthood to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus are parts of the diencephalon. After the diencephalon, we have the mesencephalon. The mesencephalon will give rise to the tectum and the tegmentum. Tectum means roof, and we'll talk about each one of these structures in more detail and what their function is. But I'm trying to give you a hierarchical, organized view of the central nervous system. So moving more caudally from the mesencephalon, we go to the metencephalon, and that will give rise to the cerebellum and pons. The cerebellum is that heavily wrinkled structure that you typically see underneath the cortex. We'll come back and talk about its role. The pons connects the cerebellum to the cortex, and we'll see that later on. After the metencephalon, we have the myelencephalon, which will give rise to the medulla oblongata, which is a great structure to pronounce. So if you can take a chance, a little moment right now, say it out loud, medulla oblongata. We'll talk more about the function and its role and function there. And then we end up with the spinal cord. The spinal cord is, of course, very important for processing sensory and motor information from the body and relaying that up to the other structures of the brain. So just to review, we have the telencephalon, the diencephalon, the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, the myelencephalon, and the spinal cord. And they all represent certain divisions of the central nervous system that we'll talk about now across our different portions of the central nervous system here. So we'll start at the very beginning, the telencephalon, and talk about the cerebral cortex. This is probably what you're most familiar with in terms of seeing the brain in movies or other things, or any previous class that you might have taken. This is the most typical structure of the brain that you're familiar with. It's that outer structure that's got a lot of bumps and valleys, sulci and gyri. The sulci represents those grooves. The gyri represents those hills or bumps. And what we can do is talk about the cortex as its role in different behaviors. So this is one way we can divide it into lobes, is there's certain functions that reside in different lobes. In this picture we can see, this is a dorsal view of the cortex. We can see the frontal lobe here in this lighter blue color. The frontal cortex can also be seen here. This is a ventral view of the brain. We see the olfactory bulbs here, olfactory nerves there. And this is a frontal, another view of the frontal cortex. And we can also see it from this lateral view of the frontal cortex. Now, the frontal cortex plays an important role in a variety of functions. One of them is going to be in attention, being able to maintain attention. So as you're sitting here attending this lecture, you're able to listen and take notes from this lecture. That's because you have this functioning frontal cortex that's able to keep you on task and keep you attentive to what I'm saying and what's being portrayed on these slides. That's one function. Another important function of the frontal cortex is being able to recognize emotion and being able to produce emotions. So someone with damage to the frontal cortex may not be able to recognize emotions appropriately or be able to produce emotions appropriately. The frontal cortex, again, this is a lot that it's involved with, is really important for movement. So here, just rostral to the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex. So if we were to apply a little electrical stimulation on the primary motor cortex, I could get your hand and finger to move, or your muscles to move, your face to twitch. So it's very important in movement production. Again, the frontal cortex attention is emotion and movement. It's also important for language production. And so here, this portion of the frontal cortex, we have Broca's area, which is really important for producing speech. So we see that it plays a role in a variety of behaviors. So you want to make sure when you're in the car, you always wear your seatbelt to protect your brain, your frontal cortex, from hitting the windshield if you were to get into an accident, because it's involved in so many different behaviors. Now, the next lobe we'll talk about is the parietal lobe. Here it's this kind of gray charcoal-like structure here. The parietal lobe is involved in detecting sense of touch. So just caudal to the central sulcus is the somatosensory cortex. If we were to apply a mild electrical stimulation there, you would report detecting something tickling your skin or a sense of touch on your skin, depending on where we were to stimulate that. You could feel in your face or your arm, and your body's entirely mapped out across this part of the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. In addition, the parietal lobe plays an important role in constructing space. So your ability to know where, if you're sitting at a desk or you're somewhere listening to this lecture, you probably have things to the right of space, such as a water bottle or a coffee, something to the left of space, maybe your notes, a book, and you get thirsty and you just kind of reach for that item to take a drink. That ability to know where things are in space depends on your parietal lobe. People with damage to the parietal lobe often show a disease called lateral neglect. That's where they can't detect visual, tactile, or auditory information to one side of space. And they don't know that they have a problem. So these people will often only dress one side of their body, or shave one side of their face, eat off one side of the plate. So it's a very challenging disorder to try to treat because they aren't aware of this problem. It's like the radar screen that would be able to detect space. One whole spot is out and you aren't aware that it's out. So it's a very challenging disorder, but it really illustrates the role of the parietal lobe for constructing space around us. Now the occipital lobe plays an important role. It's this darker blue area here. Plays an important role in processing visual information. So this is an easy one. Occipital lobe is important for processing visual information. So it's very, very important there in that extent. Now, beyond that, we have our temporal lobe, which we see here, which is in this lightest blue color. The temporal lobe plays a role in several different functions. First, our primary auditory cortex, or ability to translate those sounds, what I'm saying, into neural code that the rest of the cortex can use, is here in the temporal lobe. So the primary auditory cortex is there. What's interesting is that there's also visual processing occurring within the temporal lobe. So as you progress from the occipital lobe down this ventral portion of the temporal lobe, you start to see things like being able to recognize color, being able to recognize shapes, and being able to recognize people. So there are actually places in the temporal lobe that are responsive to faces. And if you have damage to that part of the temporal lobe, you're not going to be able to recognize someone's face, even your own. We'll talk more about that in the visual chapter later on in this semester. So we have these different lobes. We can also look at them, see them here from a sagittal view here, where we have the frontal lobe located here, the parietal lobe located here, occipital lobe located here, and just peeking through. This, of course, would be the right temporal lobe, and this brain is located right here. So this is one way we could divide the cortex, is based on lobes and that kind of functionality, the role that they play. But there's another way that we could divide the cortex. And that is in where are these areas in terms of processing information. One way that we've done this is looked at primary, secondary, and tertiary cortical tissue. Now these maps of the cortex here depict those roles. And what we can see is the darker blue areas represent primary cortex. So you can see area 4, 3, 1, 2, 41, and 17 all reflect primary cortex, and they're involved with vision, auditory, somatosensation, and motor control. This really represents the interface between the cortex and other parts of the brain in terms, or the body. So this is the very first time, for example, area 17, that the cortex gets to process information from visual modality or a sensory system. So this is going to be fairly low-level visual processing that occurs in primary cortex, and it's just one sensory system. So 3, 1, 2 up there, that's just going to be information from the body's sense of touch. Area 17 is just going to be from the the visual system, and area 4 is the last time the cortex gets to play or process information related to movement. Area 41, again, is the primary auditory cortex, so that's going to be the first time that neural information about sound gets into the brain. So it's typically just one sensory system, very low-level processing. Now, after that, we have secondary cortex, and that would be like area 18, 19, 17, 5, or area 18, 19, 37, 20, part of the temporal versus parietal occipital areas that are involved in higher-level processing of that information. Remember, we talked about processing information about color or faces. Area 20 is going to be involved in that. So that's higher-level processing of visual information. but it's still just within one sensory system or modality. So we have primary and secondary cortical areas. Now tertiary is indicated by all of the white areas in these diagrams. That is where we have multisensory or multimodal processing of information. And you can see a bulk of our frontal cortex represents that kind of processing of information from touch and visual processing, or auditory and visual, or motor and sensory. So this represents multiple information coming in to that location, or tertiary cortex. This is typically the highest level of processing that's occurring in the cortex. And then it'll feed down into the secondary motor cortex, here 8 and 6, and then primary motor cortex 4. So this is another way that we can divide the cortex and talk about it in terms of processing, gathering information, higher level processing, integration in terms of multiple sensory systems, and then starting to send that out to control movement. Another way that we can divide the cortex is looking at the types of connections that are formed. And we see that there are 3 types of connections that are formed in the central nervous system. There are short connections that connect areas within a lobe. This would be like in the occipital cortex, going from primary cortical tissue to secondary cortical tissue. One of the things I find so interesting, talking about the cortex is the first time I got to dissect a brain. And when we were given this brain, I took a neuroanatomy class at a medical school, and I thought, we're going to get these really fancy tools. Obviously, some might even have lasers or something, because it's going to be so technical to know where I'm going. No, they set us down with the brain and gave us tools that you would use in a pottery class, basically a wood stick. And they said, work your way from the outside, the lateral portion of the cortex, and scrape off. And one of the things that we first noticed is it wasn't like pudding or some other jello or gelatinous structured jam. It was more like string cheese, where we could see all of these connections here. And so here we see these short connections going, or these little U fibers connecting 2 parts of the brain together that maybe are in the same lobe. In addition to short connections, we have medium connections, and here you can really see these as these fibers running between 2 lobes. Here's the arcuate fasciculus connecting the temporal lobe up to the frontal lobe, connecting Wernicke's area and language processing up to Broca's area and language production. And so you can see this fiber connecting those 2 together, and those medium connections are connecting 2 lobes together, connecting that information processing together. And finally, we have long connections that connect one area of the hemisphere to the other side. So here we can see maybe processing information from one side of the body is being connected to the other side of the body with these long connections through the corpus callosum. So these are those long connections that are very important for processing information in the central nervous system. And another way that we can divide the cortex in terms of understanding its function and structure. In addition to the cerebral cortex in the telencephalon, we have the limbic system. And the limbic system also plays an important role in behavior, specifically both memory function as well as emotion. The hippocampus is located here, as you can see in this structure. And this is where I think downloading that 3D brain app would be great, because I can show you what they look in these pictures, but it's so much better if you can actually just rotate the hippocampus and see how it's arranged, because this is where we start to see a spiral characteristic to several structures in the central nervous system. Here we see Hello? I think what I'll do is I'll stop here, make sure that this lecture looks good, and I'll start another lecture at this point. So there'll be 2 neuroanatomy lectures.